Just want to let everybody know that even though he's not here with us, John Lindquist is with us in spirit today from Egghead.io. So those are my Angular shirt for Angular presentations, because having John near and near my heart really helps. Also, I changed my background so that everybody would know I am a big nerd, just because there's any doubt about that. All right, so for today, those of you that were here last month or the month before, are we 2 months out now from your presentation?
I don't remember now.
I think we skipped one. I can't remember. Anyway, Mark did a presentation on like Directives Essentials, which I thought was phenomenal. Even though Mike was just saying the video was a little rough, I think it's definitely worth revisiting that if you didn't see it here in person, or even if you did. It's really, really good. I know Matt and I actually went back to that presentation several times, just taking notes and facts. This is my scribbled up copy of your presentation. It's really, really good. Strongly recommended. So what Matt and I wanted to do was, Matt Follett, by the way, was to build on Mark's presentation on like Directives Essentials and talk about more advanced directives topics. One of the things that we did is we kind of brainstormed all the different things that we could talk about, and it turned out we ended up with, I think this is 9 single-spaced pages of notes on potential topics for advanced directives. So we could easily fill up 16 of these meetings if we wanted to on topics with directives. So we're not going to try to cram in all of that. Instead, we're going to hit some of these points, dive deep on a couple of them, but hopefully give you a flavor of the kinds of things that you can do with directives that are more than just simple templating, things like that. And by the way, I want to make sure that you feel free to jump in at any point. So just because I'm sitting here doesn't mean that you shouldn't stop chewing and talk.
Okay.
Perfectly fine with me. So one of the things that Matt and I have found over the last, year and a half, nearly 2 years now of Angular stuff, is that we didn't start using directives nearly early enough or earnestly enough as we should have. I mean, you're further along with this now than I am, but I know both of us kind of ended up revisiting a lot of our earlier code. As everybody seems to, when you first start writing Angular, you end up with this very controller-dense code that you have your HTML templates and your views, and you populate all sorts of stuff inside your controllers, and you don't do nearly enough with directives. Because directives are hard, directives are a little bit weird. The documentation for directives can be extremely dense. It's better now than it used to be, but it didn't start off very easy to deal with. And because of that, people tend to shy away from them. They just don't get them. But what we found is that the directives properly used actually end up helping you create a DSL for your app, a domain-specific language for your application. I mean, what would you guess with some of the early stuff that we did when we went back and revisited it? I mean, the amazing amount of code that just collapsed out of some of the systems we were building was pretty astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, what we were able to do after we took all the kind of pieces that were that we directivized, we were able to condense most of our states into very common code base. We probably cut out a third of our code just in taking things, putting them into directives, and then having common patterns emerge from that.
Yeah, and it was kind of funny because we thought we were doing a pretty good job of encouraging reusability, and we were doing okay. But it turned out that when we really started leveraging the directives mechanism, a lot of things became much smaller, much tighter, much more reusable. So we'll talk about some of that stuff in here today. But we wanted to kind of start off with that in mind, that if you aren't using directives, or if you're not using directives much inside of Angular, then you're probably missing a major point of Angular. So we would strongly encourage you to take another look. They're not just, oh, it would be nice to have an extra HTML tag or two. It's like, no, that's probably the fundamental piece of your application. If you don't start off an application, or if you don't look at your application trying to decompose it into what could I turn into directives in this app, you're probably missing the bulk of the power of Angular. So that's the sermon. Wanted to make sure that we got that in early because, you know, if you don't leave here with anything except that in mind, then this will have been a successful meeting for you. Everything else is technique and you know, syntax and specifics, things like that. But really, it's kind of the philosophy of directives and how you use them within Angular that I think is probably the most important point that we'll make. That seemed like a... all right. So, first place that we were going to start, let's make sure I can see this here. We've got several little examples that we're going to walk through. To give you a little bit of background here on how this happened, and I'm going to blame you for some of this, by the way. This is my friend Harry, the unsuspecting victim of today's presentation. Harry and I were talking, gosh, it was weeks and weeks ago, about a couple of different ideas for directives. One of them, do you remember the table of contents directive? Like you've got an entire document structure, and you wanted to be able to like have a little summary of it that could jump you around the document. Well, I was intrigued by that, and I told my friend Matt about it, and I'm like, you know, that might serve as a pretty good example for our little advanced directives talk. Well, Matt, being the kind of guy that he is, he didn't slow down. He just went ahead and wrote one. I thought I was going to write it, but it turns out Matt's faster than I am, so he got onto it first. So here's the way that this thing looks. So down here at the bottom, this is your typical HTML document. This is, you know, H1 tags. I can show you what this code actually looks like. It's very, very simple. So just exactly what you would expect. H1's all the way down with a little bit of text in the middle. And then there's this table of contents directive here. It's got a little verbose name because we're actually going to have a couple of different versions of this. That's Bill Odom, Matt Follett, pronounced Bonf. Table of contents. This is the compiled version of this directive, which we'll show you in just a second. But that walks through the document, collects up the H1s, and creates a little table of contents out of it. Did you want to walk through the code for this guy first? Do you want to, where do you want to start with it? Is it your directive, and I don't want to go down the wrong path here?
I guess we can walk through the code first. It's really simple code.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah.
By the way, I split this into the compiled version and the non-compiled version, so this one just has the compiled tag on the end of it. So.
Yeah, I saw that. So if we'd included jQuery in this, we could have done like all the headers because we could have just used the headers find, like the colon headers finder, and gotten all the headers. Instead of complicating this by adding all that stuff, we just very easily said we're only going to use H1s for this table of contents. Since we're putting this into its own module, we can kind of namespace this and have like services that aren't really very useful to the rest of the world, but useful for our specific purposes. So we have just a service that, given an element, will go, and find all the H1s in it, or given an element, it will go and look for the parent article. Unfortunately, Angular's JQ-Lite doesn't allow you to use selectors, so you actually have to like walk up the parent tree and find where the article is. But once
again,
we have those,
if we had decided to include jQuery in this, a lot of the stuff would simply go away.
Yeah,
but we were trying to leave jQuery out as much as we could.
Yeah, and so those services just kind of exist to simplify what the directive actually does. The directive exists solely as something that happens during the compilation phase. When Angular finds the Bonf table of contents compiled directive, it calls our compile step, which just goes through and it automatically finds the parent article, so it knows what it's building a table of contents on, and then it finds all of the headers inside of that parent article, and then just for each one of those it walks through and it adds a list element for that specific header inside of an OL, and then it appends that all in so that now your table of contents after compilation includes the ordered list of all the headers inside.
And keep in mind, the bulk of this stuff is not necessarily Angular specific. We're simply walking through, a very naive walkthrough of the DOM. The Angular pieces of this are the fact that we're doing this in the compile, as the function associated with the compile property. We're not providing like a static template. We're actually walking through the DOM and generating the HTML that will get turned into our actual directive.
And yeah, so honestly, like what the compile is actually doing is almost completely irrelevant. It's just that, in fact, it's actually, and we restrict this element. Now that I think about it, we could add this as an attribute also. We just do the
Yeah, although that led to an interesting problem that I was going to bring up later. So.
Oh, okay, yeah, well, but yeah, so Angular.element is just, it's automatically wrapping this, it's creating this new OL, and it's wrapping it into the JQ Lite so that you actually have access to it, to various things like a pen. And then we're just using JQ Lite to manipulate the file.
I do like, one of the things that I found interesting about the code that Matt wrote was the fact that he's dropped a couple of services right here in, along with the directive. They're part of the module that this directive lives inside of. So I know that one of the things early on when I was writing Angular that I kind of got trapped by was the Angular seed project structure led me to think, well, certain things have to go in certain places. And it turns out the structure of your application and the module relationships are actually much more malleable than you might be originally led to believe. So little techniques like this are I think, valuable to just at least see on occasion because they show you that you don't necessarily have to do things in the very rigid structures that some of the tutorials show you. And again, a lot of this stuff like the header finder and the article finder, all that goes away in one big swath with if you include something like jQuery. Or if you wrote a service off to one side that was your own DOM traversal service. So again, that's not really the point of this example, but we wanted to make it easy for you to see what's actually happening. It's also an example of a directive that isn't necessarily limited to just its little piece of DOM. This thing is actually going on and looking at its surrounding environment and doing something interesting with it, which I thought was kind of a neat inversion of what you usually see with directives, which are very inward focused. Like, I'm going to build a chunk of functionality and it's going to live here in this little box. Well, in reality, we are building stuff into our little box, but we're looking all around us in order to figure out what goes in there.
Bill, did you say that those services are only used by this code?
Right, this is only being used in here.
So what's the advantage of making them be services versus just making them be regular functions outside of the Angular module call chain? Because you're already in an immediately invoked function, so there'll be scope to this file anyway.
You are a phenomenal straight man.
And we promoted those services for testing abilities.
Yep.
Okay, that's the answer.
Yep, and so we have some tests we can, I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, I was going to jump to that next. So here are the tests associated with that. But to answer your question, making those services and not completely hiding them away inside of that encapsulated scope means that now they're immediately available to Karma, Jasmine unit testing stuff. So there you go.
Yeah. Do you want me to
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to let you walk through.
Can we get down to the service-specific test?
Which one?
It should be header finder. There's a header finder somewhere. Might be in a different file. Is probably what it is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's. I know what you're talking about.
So yeah, since we promoted these services, we were able to use. No, that's the directed header. They might not be in there.
Article spec?
No, that's also directed spec.
Okay.
Okay, they're not in this example, but they do exist on the GitHub project. Basically, because we made them services, we could write tests around them, and so we could actually write all the tests that we needed, and we didn't have to do the whole, well, how do I test my private methods without actually having access to the scope within this function.
And that's my bad. I pulled in pieces of your project into our main project, so I didn't pull in those files. I apologize. But the idea still stands. By busting them out as services, you now gain access to them that you wouldn't get otherwise, and they're just like any other service that you would be testing in Angular. Did you want to go ahead and walk through the actual
Yeah, we can.
specs themselves?
Do that. So this spec, because those service specs are testing a lot of the functionality, this is only testing what the directive is going to be doing. So it's testing that given that I have some section element that has a child of the table of contents compiled directive and a whole bunch of headers, I want to verify that this works at the level of a directive instead of working at like all of the little individual pieces. And so we kept these specs to that level. And what you can see is like we actually go through and we build out something that's got 3 headers. It just takes each header and it
Wraps them in each one.
Yeah, it wraps them in each one. And then, so it takes each one, wraps them in each one, and then wraps all of that and puts it into a section. Or into each section, and then takes all those sections and sticks them into the article with the table of contents. And then it just goes ahead and it compiles all that. And so
This, by the way, is the technique that's worth talking about in an Angular unit test of a directive. So.
Right. Yeah. So do you want to go with that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, this is a technique that I think we picked it up from Wojta, the guy who wrote Karma. Because people were like, well, Angular is all about testability, and that's really cool and all, but how do you actually test a directive? And there is an argument to be made that, well, unit testing of a directive is a little bit strange. You really should be doing like functional level testing of a directive. But it actually is possible to do some valuable unit level testing of a directive, and this is the way that you do it. You actually create, and this is what Matt was talking about here, you're creating an Angular element and then compiling your own little chunk of DOM. So in this case, right here, when we call Angular's compile service with the article that's the element that we created, and then hand it the scope that we just genned up, what we end up with is an element that we can then do things with. An actual compiled Angular element, just in the same way that Angular walks through the DOM tree in your browser itself and finds directives and compiles them into actual Angular things. That's exactly what's happening in this chunk of code, and then we're extracting that particular element. So we're doing this before each one of our unit tests. So every one of our unit tests compiles this little miniature chunk of DOM that contains the monf table of contents compiled directive within it, so we can now poke and prod in each one of these tests.
And just for clarity, element there, all it's doing is it's looking at the article, and the first child of the article is that monf table of contents. If you look at the
so right there.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question on that line?
Yeah.
Did you have to manually rewrap that Angular element there? Because it's really odd that you had it and it was an Angular element. You asked for its children for it to give you something back that's not already wrapped for you.
So children gives you back something that's wrapped, but then if you pull the first item out of that, that's not wrapped. There's probably a method that I could have called.
Okay, so it's probably just a different method.
Yeah, instead of doing instead of accessing it by an index, there's probably some way get this one, and then that gives you back something.
And I have run into that myself multiple times. Like normally you do get back a wrapped element that's essentially a jQuery element.
Yeah.
But sometimes, like in the case he's talking about, you end up with this thing that you've got to actually rewrap again. So it's worth watching out for that. It can trip you up.
I see countless examples of people sort of, I guess, like
it's like extra layers of parentheses.
Yeah. They just every single time they see something, they immediately rewrap it.
Yeah.
Like everything, like they don't even wonder if it's wrapped. They just wrap everything. I've even seen people wrap it an Angular element and then wrap that with a jQuery $sign. I'm not really sure it's wrapped or not.
Yeah. So and it's safe to do that if you really like. If it gives you a nice feeling.
No, it's evil and wrong. Don't encourage that.
It's safe.
And so then, then from here on, we're just actually checking, did it create the DOM that we expected it to create? In this first test, we're just making sure that it appended something to it, which is really that OL. And then we go, there was a spec, I thought somewhere, that actually verified that it was an OL. Oh, it's right there.
That's right.
So yeah, so we say, okay, make sure that there's only one thing that's being appended to that monf table of contents compiled.
Because we're creating an ordered list here.
Right.
That's what it's checking for.
And so make sure that there's only one of them. And then now that we know there's only one of them, let's actually kind of treat that as the subject of the rest of our tests. Is that one thing, is it an ordered list? Does it have as many individual lines as the headers that existed in the previous one? And then this is cheap, but if I just concat all the text together from that ordered list, does it look the same as the headers that were there before? Which is implying a lot. It's implying order, it's implying content. That should be a bunch of tests, but.
Well, and these are really more stubs to demonstrate that you can grab a compiled Angular directive element and then inspect it to do different things. Now, admittedly, some of these tests, these are examples, so don't go living your life by them.
Yeah.
But it's possible to build these tests so they aren't quite so brittle. And that is one of the things that Matt and I found when we were trying to figure out what the dividing line was between what makes an effective directive unit test versus what really needs to be moved into functional testing. And where we landed was to do some of these things, but try to keep them fairly generic so that the tests aren't quite so brittle, but to do test those things like the general number of elements that I would expect to get back, the general structure of the directive. It's kind of like, it's not black box testing, maybe it's gray box testing. We want to make sure that we get the rough structure of the directive tested properly. But when it comes to how the thing actually functions, then you would move that off into more functional testing with something like Protractor, or in the case of our applications, Cucumber, Selenium, Capybara, stuff like that. So you're actually pretending to be a browser. But this can be an effective technique for basic testing of directives. And again, the important, the moral of the story is this little trick right here: creating your own scope, compiling the chunk of HTML and handing it that scope, and then grabbing the element that you're actually going to be testing. Those little pieces, that's the valuable part for actual unit testing of a directive.
One thing to note, the difference between, one of the ways that we actually do this in our production code base is, before we ever added jQuery to the actual production application, we had jQuery in testing within a couple of days, I think, of starting testing, honestly. And that gave us all of the selectors and all of the things that you get through jQuery. And so it allowed us to do testing of these sorts of things in a much easier way, where we're testing much more robustly the actual DOM structure. Yeah. Because then we get all those selectors and whatnot.
Yeah, we held off on production use of jQuery in our main application for a long time, but we used it in testing almost immediately. So that, that is the other thing to keep in mind. Just because you're in Angular and you're trying to avoid jQuery as long as possible doesn't mean that you should avoid it where it doesn't end up in a production app. Go ahead and use it. It's a useful tool. And again, if you do need it in your production application, that's not a sin. It is okay. Just make sure that you're using it within directives. Don't go loading up, just because you've decided to use jQuery within your app, that doesn't mean that all the rules disappear. That, don't start putting jQuery code in your controllers. Again, directives are for DOM manipulation. jQuery is for DOM manipulation. So use jQuery only within the directives. All right. We talked about a little bit about the compile phase. Do we want to say anything about like when compile does its thing for Angular in general? If you don't understand this piece, we'll cover it very, very quickly because it is valuable to understand. This example here is showing the way that a directive, can examine the existing document structure during the compilation phase and create essentially its own template on the fly. That's really useful, but it's happening during the compilation phase of Angular. What Angular is actually doing when you load an HTML page, so. Let's see, we'll load up index.html. So this is a Yeoman-generated HTML page that is for an Angular app, and lots and lots of boilerplate garbage in here. But the important parts are, this is an application that uses ngRouter, so there's a view container where you would expect it to be, and then a bunch of scripts, and they're at the end of the document because Kyle makes sure that we all put our scripts at the end of the document. We got religion. Anyway, all of our third-party components, and then the components of our application. Here's where Angular's actually loaded, but we've got an HTML page going on, and Angular gets loaded up, and it goes through a few phases. And one of the things it does is goes through a compilation phase where it actually walks the DOM that is created when your browser parses an HTML page, walking through that tree of nodes and finding Angular directives. So in the case of our application, we've got this page, and p tags and strong tags and article tags and div tags, that's all fine, but as soon as you hit this guy, well, that's an Angular, that's something it doesn't recognize. But when Angular is walking through this, it looks up that name in its big list of directives that we've got to find, and realizes, oh, that corresponds to something I care about, and then it builds out that that directive. It, either augments or replaces this structure with the directive definition. So during that compilation phase is when things like this stuff all happens. So during compilation, is when our directive has the opportunity to go out in the DOM and find stuff and build its little template that it uses. And that's great, except for one problem, which is what happens if this stuff changes after the fact. We'll talk about that in just a second. But before we get there, wanted to show you another directive. This one's a little simpler, even than the table of contents, but it's an expand collapse directive. So we're blaming Harry for this one again because this is another one that we talked about. This is, again, a very simple directive, and all it does is it attaches a little button to the side of a block element that lets you do things like this. Here I'm expanding and collapsing the entire element. And here I'm expanding and collapsing the individual list item, or unordered list within here. And here I'm expanding and contracting a block quote. Nothing super fascinating about this. The HTML is exactly what you would expect. So this one is not an element level directive, however, it can be attached to any block level element. So this is the expand collapse directive that's hanging off of this div. There's a similar one hanging off of this unordered list, and another one hanging off this this block quote. And what this does is simply adds that little button off to the side that lets you do a useful thing. So the philosophical point here is this is a good example of adding behavior to an existing item with an attribute level directive. The table of contents directive is an element level directive, which is great. You know, works fine. We could also do it as an attribute level directive, but in general, you had a really good way of phrasing this in your notes that I like.
Well, I don't remember what I phrased in my notes, but the basically attribute directives are supposed to be the building blocks of your actual. So the element directives are kind of your domain language. They're the things that your application is actually doing. You have a button that's performing some task. That's the do something button, right? That button should be composed of these attribute level or attribute directives that are the building blocks of that. So we have in our production code we have attribute directives that do things like pop up comment modals and pop up all these different pieces, and then we have directives that are actual buttons that combine that and a couple other things together, so that when you click a button, it fires off all of these things that all the little attribute directives added to it that performs a greater task.
So I like what I like about that is thinking of element level directives as the nouns and verbs of your DSL.
Yeah.
And attribute level directives like the one that you see here as adding behavior to those higher level elements. And now in this case, we're adding behavior to built-in HTML components or elements. There's, I didn't create a div directive that has the expand collapse capability. I simply dropped it onto the div element. Same thing with block quotes, same thing with unordered list. Essentially, any HTML block element should be able to take advantage of this. So
are you using document.create element for those element directives in order to get IE support, or do you not need that?
And this, no, we don't.
And in the case of these examples, we're not trying to reach very far back for IE. I mean, you can do a lot of that stuff. The Yeoman code that I was showing before adds a bunch of shims in for things like that if you want it. But in the purposes of this, for these demos, we're forgetting that anything before like IE 10 exists. It's possible to do, but you end up gumming up a lot of your code. I know with Merits, you've got a lot of you have to care about a lot of that stuff, which is why I don't work with Merits. So, so what does this code look like? Again, we're just defining a module that contains this particular directive. In this case, we want it to be used as an attribute directive, and again, it's because we're trying to restrict this to use on block elements, and it's not something that's intended for use on its own. In this case, we don't have a compile function, we don't have a template, we just have a link function. And the idea behind what this guy is doing is that it's going to create a stand-in element for whatever we're expanding and collapsing. So let's, to use this block quote as an example, we want to be able to expand and contract, but I don't want to change this element, the expanded element that we started with. I actually want to swap it out for a different element. So that's what this guy is doing. I'm creating a stand-in element by cloning the original element. Now remember, with our link function, we actually get parameters, our scope, our element, and the attributes for the element that we're hanging off of. So I'm cloning the original element right here, but then I'm immediately replacing its inner HTML with all of this stuff. Now, why am I doing that? Well, it's because I want to make sure that all the styles associated with this particular element get carried over for me. And I found a quick way to do that. It's not the only way, but a quick way to do that was simply to start with the existing element, clone it, and then nuke the insides of it. So in this case, I'm creating this stand-in, and I'm adding this button that you see off to the side. I'm giving it a span that contains the text that I care about. In this case, I'm starting off with the original text of the element, but that won't be where I keep it. And you'll see a little trick that I do here in a moment to talk about that. So when I collapse this, I just grab the text and throw it in here, and then I add a few more styles to do the to make the effect that you see here. So when I collapse it, I want to italicize it. I also want to make sure that it's constrained to a single line. I hide all the overflow. I stick an ellipsis on the end. So these CSS styles do all the work for me of making this look the way that it does. So again, I've cloned the element up here, ripped out all of its guts, and then added a few additional styles onto it. And again, this is mostly for demonstration purposes. I wouldn't necessarily do it exactly this way in a real application, but the technique works well enough. But then the other trick that I do is I immediately, before I ever add this this stand-in element, I add class ng-hide. This is worth knowing about. I wanted to be able to add a class that would hide this thing, and I'm like, well, I don't want to create my own class. I don't want to add more, a display none to my style. I was already feeling bad enough about adding these styles in manually as it was. Well, it turns out that the way that Angular's ng-hide and ng-show directives, the built-in directives that Angular provides, actually the way they work is by adding and removing a built-in class that's already inside of Angular called ng-hide. So by simply adding the ng-hide class, I'm able to hide the element exactly the same way that Angular would. And then finally, I'm binding a click event to the stand-in element to toggle the state to visible. You see up here at the top, I have a little toggle state function that changes toggles the ng-hide class on and off. In other words, adds or removes it based on whether or not the element is supposed to be expanded. And notice, it's got the original element that we're working on and the stand-in element, and they're just opposite of each other. So is expanded or not is expanded. So when I hide one, I show the other, and vice versa. And again, that's attached to the click event. Finally, after I've done all of this element creation, styling, binding of click events, that's when I finally add it to the DOM. Now, since it's hidden, I don't actually see anything. Important thing to note is I'm adding the stand-in element immediately after, not inside the original element. And that'll become important here in a second, because the next thing I do is I actually do add a new element inside the one that we started with. Again, remember, we're augmenting block elements, so I can do this. I'm now adding a button inside of the expanded element. That's how these guys show up. So this is the button that's on the element when it's in its expanded state. And it works basically the same way as we saw before. I don't have an encapsulating div or anything like that because it's already inside of a block element. But it's the thing that contains the chevron up or chevron down, depending on whether I'm going to expand or collapse. And again, it's also binding to the click event, toggling the state. This is the trick that I was talking about earlier. Originally, when I defined the stand-in element, I gave it the element text, and that's great unless your text contains like this, a value for main control scope, a random value main control scope. This in our HTML code is actually an Angular expression, some value that's coming from the controller that's associated with this. If I didn't go in here and update the text, notice I still have my value here, but as soon as I collapse it, notice we're seeing a little bit of that Angular expression, which is not what we want. We want the actual value after it's been evaluated and inserted into the DOM. So if I never went back and updated the text based on whatever the current value is in the DOM, then I would begin to see things like Angular expressions. I also can't just evaluate that expression on the fly, because just evaluating the raw text of the element may actually change the nature of the expression. So I need to grab the text at the point where I'm actually doing the collapsing. So in this case, I'm finding the text, I'm setting the text of the stand-in element to the text value of the expanded element itself. But again, the important part is that I'm collapsing and expanding. Finally, after I've done all of these things, I'm prepending the collapse button into the contents of the block element. And again, this is not a dot after, this is actually a dot prepend, because I want it to be inside of the block element. So, all of that just to be able to do this trick. And again, there's a lot more that I could do in order to, make the spacing correct and all of this. But this just demonstrates that it does actually work. This is an example of it working in a nested fashion, because these things are inside, and this contains the whole thing.
Bill, I think a potential gotcha here, I can imagine somebody writing this directive might think, well, when I create the button, I'll just put an ng click on it. I don't need to do that bind.
Right.
That would be problematic.
Well, you could do that,
recompile.
and in fact, there was a version of this that I did that on, but you do run into needing to recompile things, which I wanted to avoid. The other thing was, and again, you're just like the perfect straight man in the crowd. Notice that my scope up here, I've got set to false. Originally, I had an isolate scope on this guy, because I default to isolate scopes no matter what I'm writing until I can't use an isolate scope for some reason. Well, the very first thing I wanted to be able to do with this guy is add it to our table of contents directive. I wanted to be able to expand and collapse the table of contents directive. But it's got its own scope associated with it. As soon as I tried to use an isolate scope in conjunction with that other scope, I ran into collision. Angular starts complaining that I can't have both of those on the same element at the same time. So in this case, I'm saying scope false to just use whatever scope I happen to be sitting in at the time. And when I did that, I didn't want to pollute my scope at all. So using an ng click would require that I hang my toggle method off of the scope.
So I didn't know Angular would complain about that. You're talking about two directives on the same element that both ask for an isolate scope. I guess I was wrong. I thought what happens in that case is that it creates one scope and they share it.
That was my understanding as
But
well.
You're saying it actually complains about it?
And in the documentation, at least in the earlier versions of the documentation, that's exactly what I saw as well. But in the particular case here, when I tried to do it that way, I got an error from Angular that was really, no, I can't do that. I can't have both of those. Now, I did play with several different combinations, but I didn't want to mess with the table of contents directive. So I figured this was probably a better example of, all right, how would I do this without adding anything to the scope at all for this particular directive? This is an attribute directive that is sitting in a shared scope. So what can I do to be the best possible citizen of that scope? And this is just the technique I came up with. But because I ran into that, I'm actually going to go explore that more and see if I can figure out exactly what the combinations are. And Kyle, you may know. I couldn't remember.
If you use require, the one directive is pulled above the other, and you
Okay, that could very well be it. In this case, it wouldn't work for me here because I don't want this directive to have to be aware of any other directives. So, so I did end up in this case where I need access to things and I need to be able to do things, but I didn't want to hang them off the scope, because if I did, I'd have to come up with some really ugly name to make sure I didn't run into a collision. But in general, I tried to come up with a way to do this that didn't require adding anything extra to the scope at all. So if I'd used ng-click, yes, I would have probably had to go through a compile step, and I would have had to hang my methods off of my local scope, in which case I'm adding something to the scope that may not be expected by the people that are consuming this. So, all of this works, and again, this is intended to be used all by itself, in conjunction with existing elements. But of course, the thing that we immediately want to be able to do with it is add it to our table of contents. So this is the same code that you saw before with one tiny addition. It's got this guy in it. So in here, we had our table of contents here before, but now I want to make sure that I'm actually able to expand and contract it. So, can I? Indeed I can. So this is an example of exactly what Matt was talking about earlier. We've got this top level, element level directive, and we've added some additional behavior to it by simply hanging another attribute directive off of it. The table of contents directive knows nothing at all about the ability to expand or collapse things. They're both just written in such a way that they can live together, and one can add functionality to the other. This is something that I don't think we see enough of in Angular applications. Again, people tend to think of, I'm writing directives and they're going to be this encapsulated chunk of functionality. That's great, but it's just as important to add these, augmentation, reusable kind of behaviors, often via attribute directives. And if you write your directives properly, you can get a lot of functionality, a lot of behavior almost for free, without having to constantly add it over and over and over again to lots of different elements. Are there things you wanted to say about that? I kind of went off on that explain class thing. So.
No, I think that was good.
All right. Any questions so far, by the way? I know I'm rocketing through a bunch of stuff. So. All right. Real quick, this isn't one that we wrote, but it'll be useful for the next demonstration, so I wanted to show it real quick. This is a directive that Brian Ford, who's on Google's Angular team, wrote that uses a service. He didn't write the Markdown service.
No, it's Showdown.
Yeah, it uses the Showdown Markdown parsing library wrapped inside of a directive, so that you can do things like, this is my text. As you do that, this is actually being parsed as Markdown and turned into HTML. So here in our, where is it? Here in our HTML, all this is doing is you've got a text area that's attached to a data model, and then you have a div that has Brian T. Ford's Markdown directive that consumes the data model and generates the HTML for it. So this is really handy. It supports all the typical Markdown stuff, just like you would expect, and that's great. Well, the reason that we're showing it to you is because it's a really good example of dynamically generating HTML. All this stuff that's happening down here inside of this div, we've got H1s being created and taken away and all sorts of dynamic things happening down here, and that's great. So of course, as soon as we do that, we obviously are going to want to add a table of contents to it. What do you think the problem is going to be? Everybody talking about
HTML is generated, so that's compile time.
Exactly. So here in our compiled version of this thing, this guy is happening at compile time. It's looking at this document structure here, and as soon as we start doing that dynamically, nothing useful is going to happen. So if I, here's my Markdown text. I'm generating a table of contents based on whatever happens in here. So let's see if it actually works or not. So table of contents using the compile directive. So here is my text. Well, that's fine. That's great. I'm generating the HTML. So I should get an H1 now. So section 1, section 2. Well, nothing's happening in my table of contents for exactly the reason you just said. The directive, the table of contents directive, only had a chance to look at the HTML at the point it was all during the compilation phase. So unless we were willing to do something like what we were talking about a second ago and actually rerun the compile manually, then we're not ever going to get this updated table of contents. That's a problem. So Matt, being the incredibly productive dude that he is, went back and rewrote the table of contents directive. And in this case, we have a dynamic version of this. So the table of contents is now no longer the dash compiled version, it's just the table of contents. Same code otherwise, so what does that actually look like? You can see it's actually beginning to update. So what's different? That's your cue.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things different. Actually, there's no separation across the new version and the old version. In this version, we actually played with kind of a fun topic. We overloaded the article and header directives. So now, if a standard HTML element of article or element or a header shows up, it actually does stuff now. And if you can go down to the bottom where we do the headers, basically all we're doing is during the linking phase, we automatically alert that an article, a new header's been, we register a new header with the article, and then when it's destroyed, this one actually doesn't need to exist, but it's there. And then when the element's destroyed, we go back and we unregister it with the header, so we just keep a registry of all of our headers that existed. This requires, for this to work, it requires that there is an article above it. The article controller up above is the one that's actually keeping track of this header registry. So its controller has some methods that it provides publicly, unregister header and register header, and then list headers. And so that just allows you to easily say, like, okay, push a new header on, take a header off. It allows you to, every time the registry's been changed, it broadcasts that event for anything that's listening on that. So because we have that parent-child relationship that we created from elements that already existed of article and header, now when a header is added, the link step fires up a message to, or it calls out to the article's controller, adds itself to the list, and then when the header is removed, it removes itself from the list.
Just to point out, this require here with the caret article basically says this table of contents directive has to live inside of an article element, and by doing that, that's what gives us this additional parameter on the link function that is the article's control.
And just to be clear, there are other ways that, and probably easier ways to have implemented this. This was a little bit out of the fastest path, but it kind of got to show the whole parent-child hierarchy that you do, or the require stuff. Yeah, so we basically made that article as our common communication between all of our headers and our table of contents. Now, during the link phase, our table of contents generates. Actually, can you go down a little bit? It sets a handler for when registers or when headers are registered or unregistered. It automatically reruns the generate all the table of contents. So it clears it out, and then it just looks through that registry and builds out that table again. I was lazy, so this does not properly indent based off of the header level. But that's an exercise in
Exactly. A couple of things to point out here is that actually these are slight changes from when you gave the code to me yesterday. Originally, when this code was created, there was a step in here that blew away the entire contents of elements. So remember, we're in the link function. We get the reference to the element, and Matt's original code was saying, element.empty. It was just nuking whatever was inside of the element. That worked great for this particular directive, but remember, the table of contents directive, the expand collapse directive actually adds things to the DOM or to the elements inside of this block. So what I ended up having to do was come in here and make a minor modification that specifically removes just the ordered lists that Matt's putting list items in, and in this case I also added a little stub for when the table of contents is empty. And so I removed both of these things if they happen to exist, just so it doesn't blow away anything that another directive adds to it. In this case, the expand collapse directive is adding that button. And if I didn't, get rid of the original .empty call, as soon as this ran the first time, it would blow away anything that got added to it. You want to go and talk about the tests as well?
Yeah, so kind of one of the neat things, because we wrote the tests for this, or because we wrote the test for the original version to be just very high level, like this is how we expect the table of contents thing to work, or to act in the world, not how is it actually implemented. One thing that you get is all of the original specs are still here. As brittle as they were, none of them failed. We just were able to copy them over. The only thing we had to change was the name of the element, since the previous one was called bomb table of contents compiled. We changed that to bomb table of contents. And actually, in one of the versions of the code that exists, we didn't have to do that because they were just named spaced differently. And then we added a bunch of additional tests that new specs that go through, and because the old one didn't actually handle headers 1 through 6, it verifies that. And then, actually, I don't know that I don't think any of the new specs are actually all that terribly exciting.
Yeah, additional
They're
things.
just additional, yeah. Since we've written that at the level that, since we've written our directive specifications at the level of this is how the directive should act in the DOM, we didn't have to go and rewrite those. We didn't have to change anything. We just got to add new stuff as new functionality came out. If we switch over to the article or the header directive or header specs, though, we also got to add specifications towards this stuff. So we got to add, we go ahead and we say,
This is the same trick that we saw before, where we're
yeah,
creating our own little miniature.
yeah, down there. And then what we're doing is we're verifying that, and this was a little bit roundabout, but what we're doing is we're verifying that when you register, this is the article specs. So it's just testing the registration stuff. When you register a header, you get the headers back. When you register multiple headers, it doesn't screw up the order, that sort of thing. It broadcasts the proper events. Now you want to jump to the header specs. And then we have specs on the header themselves that say, okay, put some headers under the article, and then every time that we add one, make sure that the headers actually show up in the spec. So we go ahead and we create like a header, and here's the title, test header registration. We go ahead and we create one, and then all we do is we make sure, like, okay, I've added a header, make sure that header shows up in the registry. I've added 2 headers, make sure it shows up in the registry. I add headers of different types, and they all show up in the registry, and it just does all those permutations between headers 1 through 6. And then 1 and some other one, or 2 and some other one. That sort of thing.
But again, we're getting to all this stuff by instantiating just the article element.
Yeah.
And remember, this is the article element, which is a default HTML element that we have augmented with additional functionality behind it with a directive. And then it compiles it, and we're grabbing the controller off of the compiled element.
Yeah.
So again, another good technique where before we were looking at the actual element itself. In this case, we're saying, no, we want the element's controller associated with it. So then we can actually do all of these things with the controller.
For testing purposes, it's really useful to know that an element, you can call .controller on it, and you can get the controller for that's control. The controller, you say controller and then the name of the controller, and it'll give you the controller with that name on the element. If you say .scope, it'll actually give you the scope that's associated with that element. And if there's an isolate scope associated with it, you can call .isolate scope, and it'll give you that scope instead. So that's really useful when you're testing, or honestly, if you're just in Chrome DevTools, you can quickly pull out the scope and start looking at what's going on inside of your application.
Yeah. And just last piece here in the last minute that we have, wanted to demonstrate that with the new dynamic version, we now have our ability to expand and collapse even on that one as well. So all of the pieces still continue to work together. No changes were necessary on the expand collapse directive to make it work with this new directive. And again, it all still, it's exactly the same directive as before, so it continues to work just like it did before. So we are at 12:59. We were shooting for finishing by 1 o'clock and demonstrating a handful of techniques. Getting a little bit of philosophy of directives out there, demonstrating how it's possible to test some stuff. We hit things like require, we hit things like a little bit of we didn't talk much about destroy, but you can see some examples of destroy dealing with the element or the event handling stuff that Matt was doing before. Any questions about what we've shown, or about anything else that you saw us talk about and didn't mention?
Just a comment, really. It's interesting to me that you had that bug that subtle bug that you fixed, where the one directive was clobbering the collapse directive.
Right.
You realized, that kind of encapsulates, microcosm all that's bad and terrible about unrestricted access to the DOM, right?
Yeah.
The whole purpose of directives, I guess, to insulate you from that.
Right. And in this case, I brought that up to give an example of the kinds of things you might run into when you're trying to do this little surgical insertion of something into somebody else's sandbox. But also that if you're trying to build directives that allow for that sort of augmentation, then that's something to keep in mind. Being a good citizen can go both directions. In this case, I would have written the directive exactly the same way that Matt did initially, because it was just simplest. Just blow away everything inside and put something else in the middle. But with a tiny bit of additional, somewhat defensive coding, you could be a little more careful about, a little more surgical about the way you actually create your own directive, and then allow for other people to do things in an intelligent way to your own directive. So kind of a, lightweight best practices sort of thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
In one of these things, when you were assembling your table of contents, and hopefully the answer is it's just test code, but why did you do that 1996 style string concatenation?
Oh, that's exactly it, because I didn't want to have other
And G
places to.
repeat.
Yeah. In this case, it was originally like this much text, and as I built out the example, it just got bigger and bigger. So, but no, that's a very good point to raise. That's, again, a lot of demo code here to just get some of the ideas across, but there are definitely better ways than putting a big blob of, concatenated string in the middle of your code.
Because I don't need Angular to put a big blob that's
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Well, when you're done, I was
Go ahead.
going to say one thing to your point, Scott. The Angular docs actually recommend that when you're writing directives that your element directives are primarily the ones that are actually modifying the DOM, because you can't have two element directives on the same thing. And so that's generally like what they recommend as a best practice. I think that's a little, you can't do it all the time, because if you want to reuse something, then it's going to be an article or an attribute directive, and so you have to fight that. But that's how they recommend getting around that in most cases, is your elements modify the DOM, your attributes modify the behavior.
And in this case, this is something of a special case, because we are deliberately wanting to go inside of a block directive. It would have been 100 times easier to simply wrap a directive. It's like, okay, I'm going to expand or collapse something, so in order to do that, I'm just going to wrap whatever is already there. There's lots of examples in some of our other code where we take an existing HTML tag and just put boilerplate code around it. And the whole point of the directive is to not have to actually specify that code in your template. So by augmenting the input tag, for example, we could wrap it with some other tags. So in this case, if I wanted to, I could wrap a block element with another block element that would contain the stuff, and then I wouldn't be having to dig around in the innards of something else. But I thought it was an interesting example to show. In a single example, it shows both going inside and adding another element, a sibling element along with something else, and then a couple of techniques going back and forth between the two. But no, exactly. The point that you raised is a good thing to keep in mind when you're doing stuff like this, because if you're building directives, be nice to people that might use them, and if you're doing the sorts of things to other directives, keep in mind the things that can trip you up.
One of the kind of crazy things, if you looked at the Angular UI project, is their mobile is actually a service. It's not a directive. You actually call, you get the mobile service, and then you say like open or whatever, and that actually opens a mobile dialog, like a window pop up. And one of the that seemed really weird to me for the longest time, but one of the things that means is it means that your directives that you have that are attribute directives, they're not modifying, they don't have to modify the DOM, they're not touching the DOM at all. They're using this one mobile service that happens to actually be going and doing a lot to the DOM. But you're not, your one attribute directive, you could have like 6 of them on there, and while they're modifying the behavior because they're causing things to happen, they're not actually modifying the DOM in that case. They're not creating new things or destroying things.
Any other questions?
Great, everyone done.